Joseph Carter. Moissaye Olgin as a historian, on some of his recent criticism on Trotsky's history. July 1933. From The Militant, Volume 6, Number 37. July 29, 1933, page 3. Transcribed and marked up by Aind O'Callaghan for the Encyclopedia of Trotskyism Online, ETOL. Quote, Lenin lives in an imaginary world in which he mistakes the creations of his mind for realities. Unquote. Quote, it would seem that Lenin's radicalism only blocks the road of the Russian Revolution by calling forth a reaction by adding to the disorganization of a country shaken to its foundations. Here, as ever, Lenin's tactics, seemingly extreme, are in reality weakening the strength of democratic Russia. Unquote. The Menshevik who penned the above lines, in Asia, December 1917, is none other than the present Stalinist knight in the struggle against Trotskyism, Moissaye Olgin. His latest miserable attempt to carry out the teachings and dictates of Stalin takes the shape of a review of the collection of Lenin's writings from the July days 1917 to the October Revolution, recently put out in 2 volumes, Towards the Seizure of Power by international publishers, in the theoretical organ of the American Communist Party, The Communist, May and June 1933. The occasion is utilized for an attack on the views of the left opposition and Comrade Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution. In typical Stalinist fashion, Olgin confuses the relation between the democratic and the socialist revolution and the theory of the permanent revolution. To appear objective, Olgin quotes a lengthy, and we may add, representative section from Trotsky's history and comments. Every sentence of this declaration is just the opposite of historical truth and only reveals Trotsky as what he is, a falsifier of history. No less, let us requote the section. Quote, from the year 1905, the Bolshevik Party had waged a struggle against the autocracy under the slogan democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. This slogan, as well as its theoretician Plekhanov, stubbornly opposed the mistaken idea of the possibility of accomplishing a bourgeois revolution without the bourgeoisie. Lenin considered that the Russian bourgeoisie was already incapable of leading its own revolution. Only the proletariat and peasantry in close union could carry through a democratic revolution against the monarchy and the landlords. The victory of this union, according to Lenin, should inaugurate the democratic dictatorship, which was not only not identical with the dictatorship of the proletariat, but was in sharp contrast with it, for its problem was not the creation of a socialist society, nor even the creation of forms of transition to such a society, but merely a ruthless cleansing of the Augean stables of medievalism. The goal of the revolutionary struggles was fully described in 3 militant slogans: Democratic Republic, confiscation of the landed estates, 8-hour working day, colloquially called the 3 whales of Bolshevism. Unquote. Leon Trotsky, History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1, page 314. Every sentence a historical untruth? Olgin raised the question of Lenin's view of the hegemony of the proletariat in the bourgeois democratic revolution in order to prove that the latter saw in this the transition of the democratic into the socialist revolution. He quotes a number of writings from Lenin to prove this contention. But the basic questions still remain. Is it true that Lenin, before 1917, considered the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry as the culmination of the bourgeois democratic revolution? Did he understand, as Trotsky in his theory of the permanent revolution did, that the solution of the democratic tasks would be solved by the proletarian revolution, through the institution of a proletarian dictatorship? And lastly, how did life itself solve this dispute, in the form of the democratic dictatorship or the proletarian dictatorship? Olgin, in his polemic against Trotsky, quotes Lenin's 2 Tactics of Social Democracy in a Democratic Revolution written in 1906 to prove his contentions. But it is precisely this source that the same Olgin used to prove the exact opposite in 1917. We read, quote, in his 2 Tactics he, Lenin, said, the stage of Russia's economic development, forming an objective condition, and the stage of consciousness and progress of organization among the masses of the proletariat, forming a subjective condition intrinsically connected with the objective, makes an immediate complete emancipation of the working class, introduction of socialism, impossible. Even Lenin would have to admit that both objective and subjective conditions have not changed substantially since 1905. Obvious nonsense, J.C. Yet here he is, preaching the establishment of socialism in war-ridden, impoverished Russia. End quote. Asia, December 1917, page 783. The quotation from Lenin proves the converse of what Olgin now attempts. We may add that his comment is not above level of his present writings. When a group of Red professors edited a history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union under the guidance of the Trotsky killer Yaroslavsky several years ago, they recorded Lenin's change of strategical line between 1905 and 1917 only to bring on their heads the charges of quote-unquote Trotskyism. Yaroslavsky was forced to indulge in self-criticism. This Leninist now formulates the question in a new way. The completion of the bourgeois democratic revolution was a byproduct of the socialist proletarian revolution of 1917. Communist, February 1932, his emphasis. This formulation is in direct contradiction to the official Stalinist position on the colonial question. To get back to Olgin, many years ago, this gentleman translated a number of Trotsky's writings from 1905 to 1917, particularly treating with the theory of the permanent revolution. In his preface to Prospects of a Labor Dictatorship in Our Revolution, Olgin wrote, quote, "Whatever our attitude towards the course of events in the 1917 revolution may be, his are revealed in the quotations from Asia, J.C. We must admit that in the main, this course has taken the direction predicted in Trotsky's essays. There is a labor dictatorship now in Russia. It is a labor dictatorship, not a dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. All this had been outlined by Trotsky 12 years ago. When one reads this series of essays, one has the feeling that they were written not in the course of the first Russian upheaval. The essays appeared in 1906 as part of a book by Trotsky, entitled Our Revolution, Petersburg, W. Glagolev, publisher, but as if they were discussing problems of the present situation. This more than anything else shows the continuity of the revolution. 12 years ago, those essays seemed to picture an imaginary world. Today, they seem to tell the history of the Russian Revolution. We may agree or disagree with Trotsky, the leader. Nobody can deny the power and clarity of his political vision." Unquote. The present-day fulminations against the theory of the permanent revolution cannot change the essential accuracy of the comments made above. Olgin, however, does not reach his real heights until he treats the question of the origin of the November insurrection. Here the gentleman finds Trotsky once again guilty of falsifying history. He quotes Trotsky as saying that the idea of an insurrection took form from the moment the order was given for the removal of the troops from Petrograd and the Petrograd Soviet decided to organize a military revolutionary committee. The meeting Trotsky refers to was held on October 22. Quote, "The idea did not take form before because it was not advanced by Trotsky. The father of the idea was most naturally Trotsky." Unquote. With this attempt at sarcasm, Olgin continues to cite quotations from Lenin where the latter called for insurrection before October 22. Is it possible that Trotsky was unaware of this or tried to hide it? Is it true that even Trotsky first conceived of insurrection on October 22? One need but turn to Volume 3 of the History and find a complete chapter on Lenin's continual proposals for insurrection from July upward. Olgin read this chapter, but he assumes that the readers of the Communist have not and will not do so. Even Olgin can easily understand that what Trotsky means in the quoted paragraph is that the idea of insurrection first took form at that moment among the masses in the Soviets rather than in the minds of Lenin and Trotsky. Further, that the idea was then concretized that the Soviet rather than the Bolshevik Party directly or a new organ would be the official instrument of the insurrection, a question not definitely decided up to then. Olgin's purpose is not the review of history. It is rather that of discrediting and slandering the present-day Marxists. Finally, Olgin disputes Trotsky's statement that the official Stalinist historians present the question of the voting of the Bolshevik Central Committee on October 23 for insurrection as though the entire party leadership except Zinoviev and Kamenev stood for insurrection. The constant rewritings of the history of the Bolshevik Party for the factional purposes of the Stalinists are notorious. Olgin, however, finds a quotation to serve his purpose. We assume that he picked the strongest available. Quote, "The course on insurrection taken by Lenin, however, met with resistance on the part of some members of the Central Committee, in the first place on the part of Kamenev and Zinoviev." Unquote. This reads A History of the Russian Party by Bubnov, present Commissar of Education. Who are these others? Not a word. They are revealed when the individuals fall in the bad graces of the present ruling regime, as Kamenev and Zinoviev have on a number of occasions. For the Stalinist historians to literally confine the disputes on insurrection and other questions to Zinoviev and Kamenev alone would require the suppression of about 9/10 of Lenin's writings between July and November 1917. This has been found impossible even by the expert Stalinist censors. So they resort to anonymity with regard to the other personages. The world revolutionary movement will have to purge itself of the falsifiers and revisionists of Marxism. The extensive staff of official historians and theoreticians exemplified by Moissaye Olgin. Second article. John G. Wright and Joseph Carter. A reply to Olgin. August 1935. From New International, Volume 2 No. 5, August 1935, page 171 to 174. Transcribed and marked up by Aind O'Callaghan for the Encyclopedia of Trotskyism Online, ETOL. Trotskyism. Counter-Revolution in Disguise by M.J. Olgin 160-page New York. Workers' Library Publishers. 15c. To page for the physical destruction of Trotsky and the Trotskyists, this obstacle and danger to the power, policies, and privileges of the venal bureaucracy, the falsifiers of history, now turned social patriots, are preparing to go one crime further, to frame up Trotsky and his co-thinkers as assassins, as terrorists whose aim is to murder Stalin. The GPU was involved in the assassination of Kirov, see New York Times, January 24, 1935. But this attempt to link Trotsky with the terrorists through a provocateur failed. Is there another, a bigger and better frame-up in preparation? There is. S.V. Kossier, reporting to the Kiev Party membership on June 13, 1938, stated, quote, "It is absolutely clear to all of us that both Zinoviev and Kamenev were not only the inspirers of those who shot at Comrade Kirov. They were the direct organizers of this vile assassination of Comrade Kirov. They acted in complete harmony with the counter-revolutionist Trotsky. Recently, in his statements abroad relating to the assassination of Comrade Kirov, Trotsky openly revealed his terrorist position, openly called for terror against the Bolsheviks, against the leaders of our party. All distinction between him and the White Guards has long since disappeared." Unquote. Pravda, June 22, 1935. And here is Olgin in America. Quote, "He, Trotsky, has a dream now, to see the leaders of Bolshevism assassinated." Unquote. Page 22. The seventh, main, and final feature of Trotskyism is support of intervention and killing of Soviet leaders. Page 49. Quote, "From this to the decision of some inflamed follower to kill the leaders of the revolution is only one steppage." Unquote. Page 137. Quote, "The extreme logical followers of Trotsky resort to the revolver." Unquote. Page 65. Quote, "Do the Trotskyists knowingly create a psychological atmosphere that would fire some madman to attempt the murder of Stalin?" Unquote. Page 149. There is no mistaking the sort of atmosphere Olgin is trying to manufacture in his Trotskyism, the 160-page book by him issued in carloads, at a ridiculously low price. Unlike Kossier, Olgin can only insinuate about the connection of the Trotskyists in the assassination of Kirov. Quote, "Did the Trotskyists of America maintain a direct connection with the Leningrad Center, out of which came the assassination of Kirov, or were they only appraised of its existence?" Unquote. Page 136. But, like Kossier, he too states openly what his job is. Quote, "Today one exposes Trotsky as a counter-revolutionary renegade who inspires, in Moscow, they say, organizes JGW the murder of revolutionary leaders." Unquote. Page 144. Here we have the literary provocateur at work. And Olgin's qualifications? Suffice to mention here that Olgin is no novice at exposure, nor at getting the proper emotions across the footlights, and of presenting a character in his proper relation to the plot. He is the author of at least one produced play, and even a hack's knowledge of stage effects comes in handily in plying the art of Stalinist provocation. Some 40 years of Trotsky's life have been spent under the banner of revolutionary Marxism. It is an impossible feat to palm off a Marxist for the advocate of individualistic terrorism. This contradiction must be resolved. Olgin must therefore build up a suitable character, for he is not in Alice's Wonderland where one may skip 40 years. Hence arises the need for a brief 160-page essay. Olgin has to explain away how Trotsky became a revolutionary figure. Sheer coincidence. A petty bourgeois with talents as a talker and scribe collided with the revolution and was swept along. Quote, "When the revolutionary labor movement in Russia was young, a man with a sharp pen and an oratorial talent such as Trotsky could easily become noted." Unquote. Page 9. The Russian Revolution and all the Olgins were then young and inexperienced. A credulous youth. But the Russian Revolution grew a little older. How to explain away experienced age? Olgin crawls out of his skin, producing quotations from old controversies, distorting history, and undertaking psychologic excursions into the petty bourgeoisie to prove that Lenin never considered Trotsky a Bolshevik. That Trotsky was an alien body within the organism of the Bolshevik Party, even when he was a member of its political bureau, page 15. That Trotsky only assumed the name Bolshevik, but remained a petty bourgeois. Once a petty bourgeois, always a petty bourgeois, and, therefore, logically and artistically a consistent character for a White Guard assassin. In 1907 Lenin said, quote, "A few words about Trotsky. There is no need here for me to dwell on our differences with him. Suffice to mention that Trotsky in his booklet, in defense of the party, has publicly expressed his agreement with Kautsky, who wrote about the economic community of interests between the proletariat and the peasantry in the present revolution in Russia. These facts suffice so far as I am concerned to recognize the closeness of Trotsky to our views." Unquote. Minutes of the London Congress of the SDLPR, Paris 1909, page 329. Are italics. On November 14, 1917, at the session of the Petersburg Committee of the SDLPR, Lenin said, quote, "I cannot even speak about this seriously, agreement with the Mensheviks and the SRs. Trotsky has long ago said that unity is impossible. Trotsky has understood this, and since then there hasn't been a better Bolshevik than he." Unquote. Bulletin of the Russian Opposition, number 7, 1929, page 33F. But what are photostats or Lenin? Or any number of facts and documents to the contrary? Quote, "Lenin did not consider Trotsky a Bolshevik." Unquote. Signed, Olgin, page 10. And the provocateur must next rewrite the history of the October Revolution to fit his character. Who led the October insurrection? Quote, "Wasn't he, Trotsky, the leader of the revolution in 1917? Unquote. In volume 14 of Lenin's works, published in 1921, the following note is to be found on page 482. Quote, "Following the July days he, Trotsky, was arrested by the Kerensky government and indicted for leading the insurrection. After the majority of the Petersburg Soviet passed into the hands of the Bolsheviks, Trotsky was elected its president and in that position organized and led the insurrection of October 25th. Unquote. Our italics. On November 6, 1918, Stalin himself admitted as much. Quote, "All the work of practical organization of the insurrection was conducted under the immediate leadership of the president of the Petrograd Soviet, Comrade Trotsky."
Un quote, Pravda, número 214.
The role of the most eminent leaders of the party. So what? Quote, "He who knows the ways of the Bolshevik Party will easily understand why Trotsky was not among the leaders appointed by the Central Committee to direct the uprising." Unquote. Signed, Olgin, page 12. Next, the Civil War. Quote, "Wasn't he at the head of the Red Army between 1918 and 1921? Unquote. Twist and twirl as he will, the Stalinist forger has to explain away. Not a single episode this time, but the entire crucial period of the Civil War. Observe how the Stalinist squirms. Quote, "Time passed. Trotsky worked with the Bolsheviks, but he was a stranger in the Bolshevik Party. The Civil War came and, exclamation point, Trotsky was given a high post. In parentheses, evidently, another coincidence, JGW. He was, so to speak, propagandist-in-chief of the Red Army. Unquote. Page 13. Are italics. And Olgin describes how Trotsky, quote, played general during the Civil War. Quote, Trotsky traveled up and down the front, went into the trenches to talk to the Red Army men. He made great public orations, but he never led the Civil War. Unquote. Page 13. It was just a delusion on Trotsky's part. Olgin, the military expert, has to admit that Trotsky was the military commissar, just as he has had to admit Trotsky's revolutionary career. The facts are too well known, so they must be explained away. And we hear again the now familiar melody. Just a coincidence. The Civil War was young, incredulously inexperienced, and an adult man with a sharp pen, issuing crisp orders that can be quoted as examples of military style, page 13, and an oratorical talent such as Trotsky's, could easily become, not noted this time, but the Commissar of War. Just as Trotsky played at being a revolutionist in 1905, so he was now deluded, quote, into believing that he was the whole moving spirit of that tremendous historic combat. The actual facts are just the reverse. The facts are that Stalin and Voroshilov, what? No Frunze, were the great fighters on the various battlefronts, leaders with clear revolutionary vision and strategists of the first order, unquote. Page 13. Let us allow for the moment that Stalin, Voroshilov, Olgin are correct. Let us allow that Trotsky, quote, knew nothing about the organization of the army. He had wrong ideas about revolutionary strategy. As a matter of fact, his ideas about the strategy of the Civil War were so wrong that, had they been carried, the enemies would have triumphed, etc., etc. Unquote. Page 13. We want to know, why did the party tolerate such an ignoramus, and the whole Revolutionary War Council? Why wasn't Trotsky removed from his post during the years of Civil War? Why was neither Stalin nor Voroshilov, both these strategists of the First Order, appointed as the leaders, but why were they instead removed on more than one occasion from difficult sectors? Why did Lenin send telegram after telegram to Trotsky insisting on his going to the most critical sectors? Footnote 1. August 22, 1918, Svyetsk. To Trotsky, betrayal on the Saratov front, although discovered in time, has resulted in vacillation. Extremely dangerous. We consider absolutely necessary your immediately departure for that sector, for your appearance at the front reacts upon the soldiers and the entire army. Lenin, Sverdlov, April 10, 1919. To Trotsky, Nizhny Novgorod. In view of the extremely critical situation at the Eastern Front, I think it best for you to remain there. Lenin, May 7, 1919. Shakrana. To Trotsky, I have just asked the whole political bureau of the CEC, and in agreement with them I am decisively for your immediate and quickest possible departure for Kharkovy, where it is necessary to put an end to disorganization and immediately give aid to the Donets Basin. Lenin, May 21, 1919. I personally would insist on your going once again to Bogatyr and completely crush the insurrection. Otherwise there is no hope of victory. Lenin, 1 day later, May 22, 1919. I insist again on your unfailingly going a second time to Bogatyr and putting an end to the matter, because Sovkolnikov obviously cannot handle the situation. Lenin, and here is Trotsky's answer.
Kharkov-Lugansk, en route, Moscow.
To Sklonsky for Lenin, leaving for Bogatyr, where we'll try to put an end to the matter. Trotsky, May 22, 1919. End of footnote. Olgin has had to explain away too much. His forged version of the Civil War compromises the party, vilifies the CEC and Lenin. For, were his lies and monstrous exaggerations true, it could only imply that the CEC led by Lenin was guilty of the gravest and absolutely inexcusable crime before the revolution, supporting, as they are charged, an ignoramus and bungler as the head of the Red Army. The leader of the victorious Red Army was removed by the Stalinists after the Civil War from his post. 2. Having provided his brief with the required White Guard villain, Olgin must also supply the Red Hero. That is to say, he must explain away the decade of crimes, defeats, and betrayals under the leadership of Stalin. The world charlatan, the petty bourgeois adventurer in the revolutionary movement, turned into a White Guard, finds, in Olgin's fertile imagination, his nemesis in Stalin, the heroic, quote, "The world leader whose every advice to every party of the Comintern on every problem is, in parentheses, was and will be, JGW, correct, clear, balanced, and points the way to new, more decisive class battles." Unquote. Page 149. This hero in the Kremlin, who like Jehovah has a promised land to his credit, the land of socialism in one country, is likewise responsible for the ripe fruits of the block of four classes in China, the Anglo-Russian Committee, the theory of social fascism, the victory of Hitler in Germany, etc., down to the ripest fruit of all, the Franco-Soviet Pact. And the latter-day Moses of this latter-day Jehovah has a lot more explaining to do than was necessary in the Bible to establish Jehovah's infallibility. Naturally enough, Moissaye J. Olgin prefers to do most of his explaining in China, which is however not quite so far removed as heaven. The glamour and mystery of the Orient, as we know, covers much filth and squalor, but not even China will screen a Stalin. In China, if you please, there are Soviets, led by the CP of China, which early in 1935 counted over 400,000 members. Page 86. There is the Red Army, quote, "the wonder of the world, in the neighborhood of 1 million men, page 86. And the red flag with the hammer and sickle is waving over a territory embracing a population of some 90 million, about 1/5 of the total population of China." Unquote. Page 86. Then, why didn't the 1/6 of the world which is communist at least recognize the Chinese Soviets in 1/5 of China? Why not a Soviet-China-Soviet Union pact against the threat of fascism and war? Why doesn't Litvinov demand at least that this great ally be accepted into the League of Nations? Because Olgin is covering up the betrayal of the Chinese Revolution in 1925 to 1927 by the Chinese Soviets, peasant bands and peasant armies, the remaining echoes and repercussions of the 1925 to 1927 revolution, who are still able to maintain themselves due to the peculiar conditions in China, with its vast vestiges of feudal economy, the resulting economic isolation of provinces in the interior, the absence of inter-province railroads and other means of communication, etc. Trotsky, Olgin Yowles, quote, "assumed a Menshevik position as regards the very nature of the Chinese Revolution." Unquote. The essence of Menshevism is class collaboration, support of the liberal bourgeoisie. The Mensheviks in Russia not only frowned upon the peasant seizure of land, but they supported punitive expeditions against the insurgent peasants. They discouraged as provocation and adventurism strikes of workers during the revolution because all this would break the united front with the bourgeoisie. They rejected the theory and practice of the proletariat wielding the hegemony in the revolution, that democratic tasks would and could be only the results of the proletarian revolution, that only the proletarian dictatorship could and would lead to the emancipation of the peasantry and the oppressed peoples. What was the Stalinist policy in China? Stalin subordinated the CP to the Kuomintang in the name of the block of four classes: the bourgeoisie, the urban petty bourgeoisie, the peasantry, and the proletariat. After Chiang Kai-shek's betrayal, the CP was subordinated to the block of three classes. Only three faithful allies remained. So the communists entered the Wuhan government and assumed personal and direct responsibility for the punitive expeditions against the insurgent peasantry. There is no hiding the betrayal. It seeps out even in Olgin's own version. According to him, Chiang Kai-shek betrayed in March 1927. Quote, "When the imperialists began to bombard Nanking in March 1927, Chiang Kai-shek joined hands with them against the revolution." Unquote. Page 103. But Olgin does not utter a peep about what the Communist Party did after this betrayal was as obvious as is Olgin's venality. 1 month later, on April 13, 1927, the workers in Shanghai, under the Stalinist leadership, were compelled to hand over the city to their revolutionary general, Chiang Kai-shek, to be drowned in blood by their leader. As a matter of fact, the first open act of betrayal on the part of Chiang was not in March 1927, but 1 year prior to it, on March 20, 1926, the occasion of his first overturn in Canton. For years, this fact was kept from the international working class, and Olgin remains true to tradition. There is no other way to justify adherence to the Kuomintang, the party of the butcher Chiang. How else but by fraud can he justify Stalin's clear, correct, and balanced slogan, We shall never drop the banner of the Kuomintang, and they didn't. Chiang cut the throats of Chinese workers, drowned the revolution in blood, and soaked the banner of Kuomintang into a red banner. What did the Stalinists order the Chinese CP to do after March 20, 1926? What was the reaction of the masses? We give the floor to the co-reporter on the Chinese question at the 6th Congress of the Comintern in 1928. The speaker is Strakov. Quote, "Even after March 20th, we did our utmost to get along with the March 20th regime so as to keep the united front with the bourgeoisie, with Chiang Kai-shek, with the nationalists. As far as the masses were concerned, they could not be reconciled to the March 20th regime." Unquote. In Precker, October 4, 1928. The Stalinists, like the Mensheviks, refused to break the united front with the bourgeoisie, and they were taken by surprise in March 1927. After they finally did break with Chiang Kai-shek, the Stalinists sought to maintain at all costs their faithful alliance with the petty bourgeoisie. Again, Strakov, the co-reporter on the Chinese Revolution, quote, "Although we were then already fighting against Chiang Kai-shek and the national bourgeoisie, we had not yet realized the inevitability of a disruption of the united front with the petty bourgeoisie for the sake of which we obstructed the development of the mass struggle." Unquote. Ibid. Page 1251. In the Wuhan bloc, in its alliance with petty bourgeois generals and politicians, Stalinism discouraged peasant rebellions and seizures of land. The Stalinist ministers in the coalition Wuhan government violently suppressed peasant uprisings, obstructing the development of the mass struggle as part of their Menshevist delusions. Nauseating as Olgin's picture of Soviet China is, he surpasses himself in painting the Canton Soviet of December 1927. Quote, "The first Soviet was organized in Canton after the armed rising of December 11, 1927. Unquote. Page 106. Our italics. Soviets organized after the rising. But doesn't the Soviet, the highest organ of the United Front, also function as the organ of insurrection? Olgin denies the Trotskyist slander that the Soviet was created in a hurry, Trotsky. But Strakov himself admitted that there were very few people at the mass meeting in Canton. This meeting elected the delegates to the Soviet. The revolutionary wave had already waned. To Trotsky's charge that the Canton uprising was an adventuristic putsch, Olgin replies by screaming that it was one of the most heroic uprisings of the workers and peasants. Over 7,000 fighters were shot in Canton alone after the crushing of the uprising. Page 107. The blood of heroic workers and peasants has served more than once before as a cover for crime and treachery. After 1/6 of the book, devoted to the falsification of Chinese history, 2 page S on the third period, quote, "We must confess, we never found in Trotskyite writings anything resembling an explanation of why they disagreed with the third period analysis. They just scoffed." Unquote. Page 112. France, imperialist France, some 7 years ago was placed first on the order of revolution. Then, France was in a pre-revolutionary situation. In 1935, there is no revolutionary situation in France, the military ally of Stalinism. But the third period of the mistakes of the Stalintern was only meant as a cover for the defeat in China and the betrayal in the Anglo-Russian Committee. So it is best passed over in silence or with a squeal by all the Olgins. And next, 12 page S on Germany and the question of social fascism. After their united fronts with the Changs and the Picels, the Stalinists decided to play safe. No more united fronts with anybody. Only the united front from below. In talking about Germany, Olgin prefers to speak about Austria for the purposes of reducing the theory of social fascism and its fatal consequences into a mere verbalism. Quote, "In the very same way as Lenin, after the betrayal of the proletariat by social democracy at the beginning of the war, called the social democratic leaders social patriots and social chauvinists, so the Communist International called its leaders social fascists, in the sense of paving the way for fascism." Unquote. Page 114. Lenin did it. Stalin did it. That is all. Footnote 2. And many Stalinist dupes will fall for this sophistry. The Social Democrats during the war actively supported their capitalist fatherland. Their social basis, the labor aristocracy organized into trade unions, was not incompatible with imperialist war. On the contrary, it was precisely this social basis, integrated with the bourgeois state and imperialism, which Lenin cited as the historical reason for the conversion of social democracy into social chauvinism. Fascism, however, exterminates the social democracy. End of footnote. And with this piece of sophistry and hypocrisy, Olgin thinks to dupe workers, who have not experienced themselves the actual essence of the theory of social fascism, not in the sense of paving the way for fascism, but as the very instrument of fascism. In 1929, Pieck, one of the leaders of the CP of Germany, declared that the social democracy is growing more and more ripe to play the chief part should a fascist form of government be established. Labor Monthly, June 1929. At the 10th plenum of the ECCI, Bela Kun, the present head of the CI, stated, quote, "The evolution of the social democracy towards social fascism has not yet sufficiently advanced to enable us to determine whether social fascism constitutes a special and final form of fascisation in a number of countries, or if it constitutes a step towards the complete development of fascism also in countries like Germany, Poland, Romania, etc., which are on the road towards fascisation." Unquote. That was the only thing in question. Whether social fascism is a final form of fascism or a step towards complete fascism. And Bela Kun proceeds to attack the right-wingers. Quote, "The Italian development is no argument against the possibility for social democracy to evolve into pure fascism. If there is a sham fight between the social democracy and these open fascist organizations, it is by no means a fight between two principles but rather a clash between two methods of fascisation. I believe that in the present stage of the development of social fascism we have to be prepared rather for armed clashes with fascism and its social fascist organizations, more than ever before. We should do our utmost to combat the social democracy and in the first place the left wing of the social democracy." Unquote. Inprecher, August 21, 1929, page 872f. Comment is unnecessary. Trotsky and the Bolshevik Leninists repeated time and again that the social democracy paved the way for fascism, and they attacked the theory that the social democracy is compatible with a fascist government, or that in advanced countries the social fascist dictatorship would be the final form of fascism. Trotsky insisted that the social democracy would be crushed by fascism. Now Olgin changes the story. The Stalinists labeled Trotsky a counter-revolutionist for proposing a united front of struggle against fascism. Now Olgin quotes extensively from Austria to prove that the Stalinists did want a united front, but that it was impossible to make it. Why? Because, quote, "Prior to the advent of Hitler the social democracy did not believe this, in parentheses, i.e., that fascism would crush it." JGW. Unquote. Page 119.
Proof, Otto Bauer in Austria.
Did the Stalinists understand this before the events smashed the skulls of the German workers? The theory of social fascism is the answer. The united front from below is the answer. Even today the Comintern still holds that the beaten and crushed German social democracy remains, quote, "the main support of fascism." Olgin himself has to admit that between 1929 to 1932, the CP did not propose the united front to the SP. It did engage in the Red referendum. He tries to cover it up by underscoring that, quote, "In 1929 to 1932 it repeatedly proposed joint action against fascism." The real position of the Stalinists was, however, clearly enough stated at that time. Quote, "There is and can be no united front with any group of social democratic leaders. The anti-fascist united front can and will be brought about to the exclusion and against the groups of social democratic leaders." Unquote. Willy Munzenberg wrote, R. Aufbau, December 11, 1931. From bureaucratic ultimatism and exaggeration of their strength prior to Hitler's seizure of power, to shabby sophistry and apology for the betrayal after the victory of fascism, down to social patriotism today. Such is the itinerary of all the Stalinists, all the Olgins. Where are the Stalinists leading the Soviet Union? In his quote-unquote exposure of Trotskyism, Olgin tries to hide behind the achievements of the workers in the Soviet Union and argues, if you please, that Trotsky denies the possibility of a victorious proletarian revolution in one country, page 28. Trotsky, who with Lenin lead the October Revolution, is proved to have led it by mistake. he never believed in it anyway. But today one no longer argues the subtleties of the theory of socialism in one country or explains the permanent revolution. The Stalinists have promised the workers socialism in the Soviet Union, if only they shut up, endure, and toil for 10 years. Long, long ago, the Stalinists proclaimed their, quote, entry into the period of socialism. See, for example, in Precker, March 21, 1931. More, in October 1932, Manuelsky, the then leader of the CI, told the working class of the world, quote, do not forget that we shall enter classless society only with the completion of the second five-year plan. Unquote. Report to the 12th plenum of the ECCI. The workers in the Soviet Union have certainly not forgotten. Today, on the eve of the completion of the second five-year plan, the Stalinists have to prepare to account for the frightful discrepancy between reality and their theory. They are preparing to settle the accounts by more repression, and more pogroms, and greater and better betrayals. Today, the question is put squarely. Are we the willing slaves of our own imperialism or the implacable foes of imperialism and its ally Stalinism? Upon the answer to this question depends the fate of the worker state in the Soviet Union and the fate of the world revolution. Their clear and balanced social patriotic betrayal will not be masked by the literary and actual pogroms in preparation by Stalin and all his Olgins.